On today's show, we're going to set an off-season checklist for the New York Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. I've been covering the New York Mets on this show since the 2019 season. This is the number one daily podcast on the New York Mets. If you want to find any of my written work, you can do so over at justbaseball.com, where I work as the editor-in-chief. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you're going to get $300 in bonus bets used across the app. Download FanDuel today. Now, we've had about a month of off-season time at this point, trying to just forecast ahead what the Mets' plans are for this offseason. And we got Game 6 of the World Series tonight, Game 7, if necessary, tomorrow. Once that's over, the real offseason begins. A 5-day negotiating window where teams can try to hammer out deals with their incumbent players that are about to hit free agency. And then it's wide open market. Before you know it, the winter meetings are going to be here and things are going to start to pick up. So what I wanted to do on the show today is kind of revisit some of the topics we've been discussing throughout this offseason so far and set a checklist. What are the things that the New York Mets have to accomplish this offseason? And I'm writing an article about this over at justbaseball.com. The first two things on the checklist for me that are non-negotiables, you have to get this done. You got to either re-sign or replace Pete Alonso. You got to either re-sign or replace Edwin Diaz. Now, we will talk about the other big need for this team, which is an ace. But I think if you just look at what the Mets are trying to accomplish this offseason and trying to get a roster that is ready to go, that can win a World Series next year, I believe it'll be a lot harder to replace Diaz or Alonso than it's going to be to just re-sign them. Re-signing them, obviously, just a matter of meeting their price. I don't think the alternatives really make the Mets better. Maybe you're a big fan of Munetaka Murakami. Personally, I've now heard some people talking about his, struggles against velocity. I don't know if he's going to come over and be able to immediately hit the ground running for a win-now team. Those of you who aren't aware, Murakami is the top international free agent coming over from Japan. He is projected by some outlets to make upwards of $150 million. And for me, I get that might be spread out over a longer term deal than the $150 it might take to bring back Pete. But I would just bring back Pete Alonso. Josh Naylor is another fit that's out there, but it seems like Josh Naylor is going to be the top priority for the Seattle Mariners this offseason. And I think that those two sides come to reunion. If they do, then it sort of starts to become Alonso or bust. On yesterday's show, we talked about some trade candidates where the Mets can maybe send Mark Vientos out and get a first baseman back like a Wilson Contreras or a Yandy Diaz. Those guys, to me, are better complementary pieces in addition to re-signing Pete Alonso. So the first two big checklist items for the Mets is re-sign Pete Alonso, re-sign Edwin Diaz, and if not, you're going to have your work cut out for you trying to replace those guys. The other big item on the checklist is the one that we've spent literally weeks of shows talking about, which is finding your ace. And there's a lot of names that we've discussed, whether that is in free agency, if we're looking at a Dylan Cease, or I guess a Framber Valdez, or maybe you think Michael King could be an ace, or Shane Bieber has looked pretty good throughout the playoffs, but is he ready to be an ace again? Who knows? Those are some of the free agent options. We spent a lot more time on trade options for the New York Mets. Going out and potentially getting, again, a Skubal, Freddy Peralta, Sandy Alcantara, Joe Ryan, all these names that have come up. If the New York Mets this offseason are able to pull off bringing back Pete Alonso, bringing back Edwin Diaz, and landing a bona fide ace, whether that is the best of the bunch in Skubal or if it is Freddy Peralta, Joe Ryan, Sandy Alcantara, even if it is signing Dylan Cease. Getting that ace atop the rotation with those two guys coming back, all of a sudden, I think the Mets roster is in much better shape than people think. I really do. I think they need to secure that top-end talent like you always do. And in this case, a lot of it is just keeping your top-end talent. But the Mets offense was not terrible this season. Were they clutch? No. Did they go through too many droughts? Yes. Were they still a top 10 offense in baseball? Also, yes. Some stats had them as a top 5 offense in baseball. Regardless of how you want to evaluate it, the talent was there. Maybe these new coaches can come in and help the lineup just be a little bit better. Maybe not go through as many prolonged slumps. Maybe you get a little bit more out of some guys that really struggled, whether you retain a Mark Vientos, whether it's Ronny Mauricio in a full season, getting more work. Who knows exactly which hitters will most be influenced by the new coaches. But the Mets offense is not as far off as I think people might suggest. Same thing goes for this starting rotation, funny enough. Because if you're trying to add 2 starting pitchers to the mix, you're going to get to a point where you're running out of spots in this rotation awfully quick. You add 2 arms. You put Nolan McClain in that rotation because he's going to be there. Clay Holmes should be in that rotation. He had a good season. David Peterson, I still think is a viable big league starter. So if you add 2 arms, you have McClain, Holmes, and Peterson, there's a 5-man rotation that's not accounting for Sean Manaea or Kodai Senga or Jonah Tong or Brandon Sproat or even Christian Scott. So when you really start to think about where the Mets need to make additions, it's at the very top of this roster, but the depth is really not as bad as people would suggest. I don't know if they really need to add 2 starting pitchers in free agency. I think you just have to get one awesome ace. And maybe that means putting more chips on the table to land Tarik Skubal, because then if it's Skubal, McClain, Holmes, Peterson, Manaea, and Senga's your 6th starter, maybe that's totally cool, knowing that as long as you're able to retain some of your pitching depth in the minors and pull off the Skubal trade, if you're able to hang on to one of Sproat or Tong. Obviously, I think Christian Scott coming off the injury would probably not be that attractive in trades anyway, so you'll probably have him. Maybe this rotation is not in as dire of straits as people would suggest. What I want to talk about in the next segment as we continue on this checklist beyond just retaining Alonso and Diaz and getting an ace, what is the next biggest need for the New York Mets? Where else should they be looking to add this offseason? We'll talk about bats next, then we'll close it off with the arms. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the daily fantasy app where making the right call can actually pay off. You and I make decisions every day, but on Prize Picks, being right means cashing in. With football back, Prize Picks is the simplest and fastest way to get in on the action. Just pick more or less on 2 to 6 player projections, and you can turn your takes into real prizes all in less than 60 seconds. It's quick, it's easy, and honestly, it's my favorite way to follow along with football as well as basketball, because the best part about Prize Picks, you can actually make picks in multiple leagues at once. So you can take an NBA player, NFL player, put them in the same lineup. And also, if one of your picks misses, Prize Picks invented Flex Play, so you can still double your money. Download the Prize Picks app today and use the code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 in lineups after your first $5 play. That's code LOCKEDONMLB for $50 in lineups after your first $5 play. Prize Picks, it's good to be right. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Help us get closer to our next goal of 15,000 subscribers. We're now within 200. I really do appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. So when we look at the Mets starting lineup, the one non-negotiable for me is re-sign or replace Pete Alonso, as I already mentioned. Beyond that, I don't know what to put on the checklist for the Mets' needs. You could say, get a center fielder. But I ask you who that center fielder is. In free agency, you got Harrison Bader and Trent Grisham. Both guys are coming off career years. Both guys should be looking at this as an opportunity to lock in a multi-year deal. And I don't think the Mets, when you have a top 20 prospect in baseball in Carson Benge, who very well could be your center field of the future, and you also have AJ Ewing, a guy who I think is going to make some top 100 prospect list this year, who very well could also be a guy that could be your center field of the future. And who knows, maybe he's your center field of the future, Benge is your right field of the future, and so does your DH in 2 years. So when you have these potential impact players waiting in the wings, I don't think you're going to go out and say, hey, we're going to get Cody Bellinger to be our center fielder for the next 5 years, or even just assign Bellinger for the next 5-6 years, however long that contract's going to be that he's about to cash in on. I don't think that is where you should be allocating those resources. That could be dollars spent on Tarik Skubal in free agency next year. You bring back Pete. I think your lineup is sitting on pretty solid ground. In center field, maybe you are just waiting on Benge. And if you have to roll with Tyrone Taylor as a just brutal bat in your lineup, but a great defender, a lot of teams do that in center field. It's just going to be more imperative that you have plus bats in the other positions in the lineup. So that brings me to where else can the Mets add? And really DH makes the most sense because second base, you have Jett Williams coming. You have Jeff McNeil and Brett Beatty that can play second base in-house. If you trade Jeff McNeil, sure, maybe there's more of a need for a second baseman, but I don't think this team is going to go out and sign Bo Bichette to play second. I don't know how much Gleyber Torres or Jorge Polanco really helps you. So that doesn't seem like the position to add. To me, it's finding the bat that makes sense, whether that is trading Mark Vientos for a higher floor bat, like we talked about in yesterday's show. Yandy Diaz, Wilson Contreras were a couple of examples. Maybe that is signing Kazuma Akamoto, the other top international free agent, who could actually be your first baseman. Sounds like he's a pretty solid defender, guy that had, I think it was 6 straight seasons with 30-plus homers in the NPB, can play third base, can play the corner outfield spot. That actually makes a ton of sense for the New York Mets. Veteran bat that can play a little bit all over. I think the Mets have to really think long and hard about their roster construction. They got to figure out who they're trading, if they're trading anyone. You know, if you trade Mark Vientos, obviously the need for a DH is much higher. If you trade Jeff McNeil, maybe you do have to look at your options in the infield or just, you know, getting a utility type player if you don't think that Acuna is ready to fill that role, particularly when it comes to the batting side of it. Obviously, defensively and base running is great, but can Acuna hit enough where it makes sense? Maybe you trade Acuna because you don't think he can hit enough. Maybe you trade Mauricio. The Mets have a lot to figure out when it comes to this glut of infielders on their roster. But once they kind of parse through that, I do think that this team needs to find a veteran bat that they can plug somewhere. But I don't think that you're going to find that bat at your greatest position of need, which is center field, unless you trade for Luis Robert, who's coming off 2 brutal seasons. So when I try to build out a checklist for the Mets offseason, which again, I'm doing over at Just Baseball, I find myself really struggling beyond those big 3 tasks. Those make sense. Those are obvious. But trying to come up with where the Mets add, they're caught in this really strange place where you have these top prospects coming in Benge and Jett Williams. Not to mention Ryan Clifford's in AAA, Jacob Reimer and AJ Ewing are both in AA. You have those guys. You have guys that have been graduated for the last couple of years that are still trying to establish themselves in the big leagues with Beatty, Mauricio, Vientos, Acuna. And so with just these blends, it's tough to figure out who do you give opportunities to? How much room can you give for internal improvement guys to fill roles while weighing the need to win now. And again, maybe that's where the best possible solution is. You clear Vientos, you give him the change of scenery he needs, and you bring back a higher floor bat, but that higher floor bat might not have the ceiling of a Vientos. And that's the give and take here. If it's me and my decision, looking at where the Mets are at, I'm really banking on the internal improvements. It'd be crazy to just sign Pete Alonso and do nothing else to improve this lineup. But if you believe in Jett Williams and Carson Benge, those are two pretty big improvements that could be coming your way. If you believe in Brett Beatty as your starting third baseman and Alvarez being the hitter that he was in the second half, this lineup doesn't suck. And I feel like Mets fans think it does. And I don't get that. I really don't. I put polls out there the last couple days doing these trade shows on Jeff McNeil and Mark Vientos. And consensus is pretty much maybe 70% of the audience wants both of those guys traded. I think Vientos' poll came back 65-35, and I want to say McNeil's was 70-30. So somewhere in that range, a large portion of the fan base wants a big overhaul. They want a lot of things to change. But at second base and free agency, who's better than Jeff McNeil? Bo Bichette, maybe Gleyber Torres, maybe Jorge Polanco, but now Jeff McNeil's on a one-year deal. Jorge Polanco, off of a big postseason, actually kind of a misleading postseason. He came through in the clutch a lot, but his overall numbers actually weren't that great. But if Jorge Polanco gets a 2-year deal, all of a sudden McNeil looks better. Not to mention Jorge Polanco is not a good defender, which doesn't help the run prevention needs that the Mets discussed going into the offseason. Gleyber Torres, not a good defender, and probably wants a multi-year deal. So again, that give and take is something that I'm really struggling with. When it comes to the pitching staff, we're going to talk about in the next segment. What are the other checklist items outside of adding an ace? We'll go through it here in just a minute. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA season's here, and FanDuel has an offer you don't want to miss. Right now, new customers can bet just $5. You're going to get $300 in bonus bets if you win. That's right. You pick a bet, you put down $5, and if it hits, you're going to unlock $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. I love using FanDuel because it fits however you like to bet, whether it's player props, building a same-game parlay, or even jumping in live as the action unfolds. It makes watching basketball and football even more exciting. We got a little more riding on the action, a little something. Whether you're a casual fan or you love diving into the stats, FanDuel is going to make the game day experience so much better. It's quick, it's easy. It's the best way to add a little more energy to your Sunday. So if you're ready to play, download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. If you're an everydayer that always tunes into the show, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. This is our texting service. We get updates from me anytime news breaks from the Mets. You can ask me questions anytime. Take part in our Locked On Mets sign photo giveaways and get a live graphic sent to your phone during the regular season so you know who's in the starting lineup without ever having to go on social media. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, find a link in the episode description or go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. So when it comes to rebuilding this pitching staff, if the Mets land an ace and they re-sign Edwin Diaz, what else is on their checklist of tasks this offseason? When you look at the rotation, again, you have such a quantity of arms right now. I think you can count on Holmes and Peterson being in the rotation. I think you can count on Nolan McLean being in the rotation. That's 3. Can you expect one of Minaya or Senga to be good enough? I don't think that's completely unrealistic. And then you got Sproat and Tong all coming up, and you still have behind them Jack Weninger and Jonathan Santucci that were in Double-A. Again, can't forget Christian Scott. There's just a lot of pitching here already. So I don't know if the Mets trade for an ace and sign a frontline guy. I think it's one or the other. And once you get that, I honestly think this rotation is in pretty good shape. Instead, honestly, of going and spending the amount of capital it takes to get a frontline arm or an additional frontline arm, I almost think that the Mets are better to go back to the well of what has worked with them is finding these talents that are under the radar. And I know that people say, well, what about Montas? It was just that was disaster. Yeah, that one was bad. Doubling down on Sean Manaea, maybe that was the mistake. The year before it wasn't. But Griffin Canning and Clay Holmes both worked. And so I would be opportunistic on, finding a depth option, ideally in the Griffin Canning bucket of someone that you can sign, not that big of a commitment at the end of the bullpen as a long man, who cares? That could be a way to address that depth. But honestly, I really think if you're just talking about what the checklist items are for helping this pitching staff, it's re-sign Diaz, find an ace, build a bridge to Diaz. That's what matters to the New York Mets. They don't need to overhaul this rotation no matter how bad it ended. There are a lot of starting pitchers on this roster that I think you want to give some chances to next year. So when it comes to building a bridge to Diaz, to me, that's a much tougher task, and no one's talking about it. This bullpen is in way worse shape than the starting rotation because you had a ton of guys go down with TJ. Reed Garrett, Tommy John. Daniel Nunez, Tommy John. Danny Young, Tommy John. You're in a bad spot with this bullpen. Who do you have? Well, hopefully Edwin Diaz. If you have Diaz, you got Brooks Raley on an affordable club option. They're going to pick that up. So that's 2. AJ Minter coming off the lat surgery. Expectation is he should be healthy, but it's still kind of a question mark. But he would factor into that bullpen mix. Then if you start going through the 40 right now, Oscar Brazaban, I think he still has options. It was crazy. The Mets picked him up and he had like 3 options. Let me see if he has options still. I think he does, which makes him like such an underrated trade that the Mets made to just pick up this guy that has a live arm that, it says 1 MLB option that's reported as pre-2026. So yeah, he still has an option left. So Brazaban is a nice piece that can shuttle back and forth. Alex Carrillo came up. He's on the 40. He had a good season until he came up in the minor leagues. He's an option. Justin Hageman and Brandon Waddell still on the roster. Max Kranick, another guy that needed TJ. Richard Lovelady got a split contract, so he can either be in the big leagues or in the minors. Who else you got on this roster? Jonathan Pintaro, I think he's a non-tender candidate. Theoretically, you keep him, but he did not have that good of a season. You have Dylan Ross, who I think will be part of the bullpen mix for sure, and he'll be optionable. Drew Smith, I believe there's a club option the Mets can pick up. They helped him rehab from TJ, so Drew Smith could certainly be back in the fold. But to me, more important than adding a second starting pitcher is adding a second and a third high leverage arm along with Edwin Diaz. Over at Just Baseball, I did an article where I broke down the free agent market, a lot of articles where we were breaking down the free agent market, and I looked at the different setup men that are out there. So here are the setup men that you could conceivably add in free agency. It's a pretty long list. You got Tyler Rogers coming back. Emilio Pagan was a closer this past year, but he could certainly be a setup man. Kyle Finnegan is closed, but could be a setup man. Luke Weaver is going to hit the market, although there's been some reports that he might want to try his hand at starting again. We'll see how that goes. Sir Anthony Dominguez, Chris Martin, Phil Maton. That's just some of the guys that are right-handed setup man that are on the market. Left-handed, you have Tyler Rogers' twin brother. You have Gregory Soto coming back. Danny Column, I always struggle with that name. Caleb Ferguson had a good season. Caleb Thebar had a good season. Justin Wilson even had a good season. To me, because you have Brooks Raley and AJ Minter, you don't necessarily have to go out and get a lefty, but it's always nice to have another lefty in the pen. So who knows exactly who that is? Maybe you call it the Rogers brothers, pay them both, and you do what the Giants did in the past, where you have both those guys on your roster to just confuse everybody with Taylor and Tyler. And the only way you'll know who's which is which way they're throwing the baseball, if it's a submariner from the right side or a lefty. The Mets, though, to me, have to add 3 relievers. Diaz can be 1, but then 2 more leverage guys. And then, of course, they're going to do the same churn and burn of adding a bunch of arms, and it has worked for them. They've done a really good job at that. I mean, what they got production-wise out of the likes of Austin Warren and Chris Devansky and Rico Garcia, like they got incredible production from those guys. They're going to do that again, but you have to have that bridge to Edwin Diaz. So if you have Edwin in place, you sign 2 arms, you got Rayleigh and Minter, now you're cooking with gas. And now you hope a Dylan Ross breaks out and he gives you another leverage arm. But to give you my final checklist for what the Mets have to accomplish this winter, Edwin Diaz and Pete Alonso, top of the list, and aces right there with him. Those are the 3 priorities. Building a bridge to Diaz is that 4th priority. And then trying to figure out how you're going to blend veterans and young pieces for that roster. Who are you trading? Is there a secondary bat you could add? You got to be opportunistic trying to round out the position player core. I don't think it needs much of an overhaul, though, once you ensure that Pete Alonso's back. So that's what I think the Mets should be looking at doing this offseason. Let me know in the comments where I'm way off, where you think they need to add. Is there a glaring hole that I missed? I'd really be curious to hear what you all have to say. Appreciate everyone for tuning in. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe if you are watching on YouTube. If the World Series ends, I might do a little show about that. And then, by next week, we're going to be full on into the offseason here. And one of the first things that we'll be doing is talking about, can the Mets sign Diaz or Alonso before they actually hit the wide open market? What contracts could look like that would entice them to sign? So that's going to be a couple shows that'll be coming your way very soon. Really do appreciate all of you again for tuning in. Make sure that if you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, you find a link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen, your first watch every day, not for your second watch. Head over to YouTube and check out Locked On Sports Today, the first ever 24/7 streaming show. It covers everything in the world of sports with a local experts from each team, league-wide experts from each league, by Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube.